Have you ever wondered what happens behind the closed doors of royalty when the cameras stop rolling? What drives an ordinary person to risk everything for someone they've never met? This is the extraordinary true story of James Mitchell, a 58-year-old veteran security guard who worked the night shift at one of London's most prestigious museums. For 23 years, he walked the same corridors, protecting priceless artifacts and maintaining perfect protocol. But on one September night in 1997, something inside him broke, and what he did next would remain hidden for decades. When the world mourned Princess Diana's tragic death, millions gathered to pay their respects. Flowers covered every street, tears flowed in rivers, and the entire nation stood still in grief. But while everyone was watching the public ceremonies, one man was planning something completely different, something that could cost him his job, his reputation, and everything he'd worked for. Yet, he couldn't stop himself. This is not just a story about duty or loyalty. It's about the moment when a forgotten man decided that some things matter more than rules, more than safety, more than fear. It's about how one secret act of love and respect rippled through time, touching lives in ways no one could have imagined. What James Mitchell did in the darkness of that museum, surrounded by centuries of history, would prove that sometimes the most powerful tributes happen when no one is watching. Sometimes the greatest courage comes from the most unlikely heroes, and sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to do what's right. Are you ready to discover the secret that one man carried for over 25 years? The rain drummed against the tall windows of the British Museum as James Mitchell adjusted his security badge and began another quiet night shift. At 58, he had walked these halls for over 2 decades, his footsteps echoing through corridors that housed some of the world's most precious treasures. The Egyptian mummies, ancient Greek sculptures, and medieval manuscripts had become his silent companions during countless lonely nights. But tonight was different. Tonight, the weight of the world seemed to press down on every corner of London, and James could feel it in his bones. It had been exactly 2 weeks since Princess Diana died in that terrible car crash in Paris. 2 weeks since the entire world stopped spinning, since grown men wept openly in the streets, since flowers covered every inch of Kensington Palace like a colourful carpet of grief. James had watched it all on the small television in the security office during his breaks, his weathered hands clutched around cups of tea that had long gone cold. He had seen the rivers of people, young and old, rich and poor, all united in their sorrow for a woman they had never met but somehow loved deeply. James understood that love. He had felt it too, though he would never have admitted it to anyone. There was something about Diana that had touched him from the very beginning, from the moment she stepped into the public eye as a shy 19-year-old kindergarten teacher. Perhaps it was her genuine smile, the way she looked directly into people's eyes when she spoke to them, or how she wasn't afraid to hold a dying AIDS patient's hand when the rest of the world was still consumed by fear and ignorance. Diana had a gift for making everyone feel seen, even through a television screen. As James made his rounds through the ancient Egypt galleries, he paused in front of a display case containing jewelry from the tomb of a long-dead queen. The gold necklaces and precious stones glittered under the soft lighting, preserved for eternity behind thick glass. He thought about how these ancient rulers had been mourned by their people thousands of years ago, how their deaths had shaken entire civilizations. Death was nothing new to human history, but some deaths felt different. Some deaths left holes in the world that could never be filled. His mind wandered back to his own experiences with loss. James had served in the British Army for 12 years before taking the museum job, and he had seen his share of death and suffering. He had lost friends in Northern Ireland, watched good men come home in boxes while politicians made speeches about honor and duty. But military death was different somehow. It was expected, planned for, accepted as part of the job. Diana's death felt senseless, random, cruel in a way that military deaths rarely did. The princess had been trying to escape the very thing that had made her famous: the constant attention, the flashing cameras, the relentless pursuit of every private moment. James knew what it felt like to want to disappear, to find peace in quiet corners where nobody was watching. That's why he had chosen night security work. The museum after hours was a sanctuary, a place where time moved slowly and the outside world felt far away. But even here, Diana's death had followed him. The other guards talked about it during shift changes, sharing stories they had heard on the radio or read in the newspapers. Mrs. Dedden Henderson, the day shift supervisor, had cried openly when she heard the news. She was trying to help people, she had said through her tears. All she ever wanted was to help people, and look what happened to her. James had nodded and offered her his handkerchief, but inside, he felt something more complex than simple sadness. He felt angry. Angry at the photographers who had chased her through the streets of Paris like hunting dogs. angry at a world that had demanded so much from someone so young, angry at himself for feeling so powerless, so unable to do anything meaningful in the face of such tragedy. As he continued his patrol through the Greek and Roman galleries, James found himself thinking about legacy. What did it mean for someone to be remembered? The museum was full of artifacts from people who had been dead for centuries, millennia even. Emperors and artists, warriors and scholars, all reduced to fragments of pottery and scraps of papyrus. But Diana was different. Her legacy wasn't in objects or monuments. It was in the lives she had touched, the causes she had championed, the way she had changed how people thought about compassion and service. The security office was empty when James returned for his scheduled break at 2 a.m. He poured himself a fresh cup of tea and sat down at the desk, staring at the bank of monitors that showed various galleries and corridors throughout the museum. Everything was quiet, peaceful, exactly as it should be. But his mind was anything but peaceful. James had never been what anyone would call religious, but he found himself thinking about prayer, about the idea that somewhere in the universe Diana's spirit might still exist, might still be able to hear the millions of words being spoken in her memory around the world. The thought both comforted and tormented him. If she could hear, what would she want to hear? What would matter to someone who had spent her life trying to make the world a better place? He pulled out his wallet and looked at a small, folded newspaper clipping he had kept there for years. It was a photo of Diana holding a young boy in a hospital, both of them smiling. The boy had cancer, the caption explained, and was not expected to live much longer. But in that moment, captured by the camera, neither Diana nor the child looked sad. They looked connected, human, alive in the most fundamental way. James had cut out that photo because it reminded him of something he had almost forgotten after years of military service and solitary night shifts. That caring for other people was not a weakness, but perhaps the greatest strength anyone could possess. The rain continued to fall against the windows as James finished his tea and prepared to resume his rounds. In a few hours the sun would rise and London would wake up to another day of mourning, another day of trying to make sense of a world that suddenly felt less bright, less hopeful than it had before. The museums would fill with visitors, school children on field trips, tourists with cameras, scholars conducting research. Life would go on because life always went on. But something was stirring in James Mitchell's heart, something that had been dormant for years. As he walked past the Egyptian sarcophagi, past the Greek statues of gods and heroes, past all the remnants of civilizations that had risen and fallen throughout human history, he began to form an idea. It was a dangerous idea, one that could get him fired, or worse. But it was also an idea born of love, of respect, of a desperate need to do something meaningful in a world that often felt meaningless. The museum held treasures from around the world, artifacts that had survived wars and revolutions, natural disasters and the simple passage of time. But what if it could hold something more? What if these quiet halls, visited by millions but truly known by so few, could become the setting for a different kind of memorial? Not the public displays of grief playing out across London, but something private, something pure, something that honored not just Diana's public image, but the deeper truth of who she had been. As the night wore on, James's idea began to take shape. By the time his shift ended at 6 a.m, he had made a decision that would change his life forever. He would find a way to honor Princess Diana in his own quiet corner of the world. He would create a memorial that existed in secret, known only to him, and perhaps, if such things were possible, to her spirit. It would be his gift to a woman who had given so much to others and received so little peace in return. James Mitchell walked out of the British Museum that morning into the grey London dawn, his mind already racing with plans. He had no idea that his secret tribute would set in motion a chain of events that would touch dozens of lives over the next 25 years. He only knew that he had to do something, had to find a way to transform his grief and admiration into action. The princess who had spent her life trying to help others was about to receive help from the most unexpected source, a lonely night guard who had finally found his purpose. James Mitchell spent the next 3 days planning what he privately called the project. He couldn't sleep during his usual daytime hours, instead lying in bed in his small flat in South London, staring at the ceiling and working through every detail. The risks were enormous. If caught, he would certainly lose his job. And at 58, finding new employment would be nearly impossible. His pension, his security clearance, his entire future hung in the balance. But every time doubt crept in, he thought about that photograph in his wallet. about Diana's compassionate smile, and his resolve strengthened. The location had come to him almost immediately. Deep in the museum's basement levels, accessible only to senior security personnel, was a small storage room that hadn't been used in over 5 years. James had discovered it during his second year on the job, when he was still learning all the building's hidden corners and forgotten spaces. Room B47 was officially designated for miscellaneous artifacts pending classification, but in practice, it had become a dumping ground for items that nobody knew quite what to do with. Broken pottery fragments, damaged frames, pieces that had been donated by well-meaning individuals but lacked the historical significance to warrant display space. The room was perfect for James's purposes. It was far from the main public areas, rarely visited by other staff members and completely off-limits to visitors. More importantly, it was equipped with its own environmental controls to protect whatever artifacts might be stored there. James had access as part of his security clearance, and his presence there would never raise questions since checking storage areas was part of his regular duties. On Thursday morning, after finishing his shift, James took the underground to Camden Market instead of going straight home. The morning crowds were just beginning to gather as he walked through the maze of stalls and shops, looking for specific items. He felt like a spy on a secret mission, though he supposed in a way that's exactly what he was. His first stop was a flower stall, run by an elderly Sikh man named Harpreet. James had been buying his groceries at Harpreet's brother's shop for years, and the two men had developed a nodding acquaintance. Today, James carefully selected 24 white roses and a single yellow rose. White for purity and remembrance, yellow for friendship and new beginnings. Diana had always loved flowers, and James remembered reading that white roses had been among her favorites. Special occasion? Harpreet asked as he wrapped the flowers in simple brown paper. Something like that, James replied, handing over the money. For someone who can't receive flowers anymore. Harpreet nodded knowingly. Half of London seemed to be buying flowers for someone they had lost in the past few weeks. Next, James visited a small antique shop tucked between a vintage clothing store and a tea merchant. He wasn't sure what he was looking for until he saw it. A simple silver picture frame, tarnished with age but elegantly crafted. It was small enough to be discreet, but beautiful enough to do justice to whatever photograph he placed inside it. The shopkeeper, a thin woman with paint-stained fingers, seemed pleased to make the sale. Victorian era, she informed him as she wrapped the frame carefully. Probably made for someone's wedding portrait originally. James liked that. Diana had been married in that same era's grandest tradition, with all the pageantry and hope that such ceremonies were supposed to represent. The fact that her own marriage had ended in disappointment and pain made the frame seem even more appropriate somehow. The photograph presented the biggest challenge. James owned no personal pictures of Diana, and he couldn't very well walk into a shop and buy a magazine or newspaper without raising questions about his unusual interest. Instead, he spent 2 hours at the local library, carefully removing a page from an old copy of Hello magazine that featured a beautiful portrait of Diana at a charity event. She was wearing a simple blue dress and smiling directly at the camera, but her eyes held a depth of compassion that went far beyond mere posing for photographers. James felt guilty about damaging the magazine, but he told himself that Diana's image belonged to the people who loved her, not to any publisher or archive. He would give this particular image a home where it would be treasured and protected, which was more than could be said for most celebrity photographs. The final item on his list required a visit to a religious goods store near Westminster Cathedral. James wasn't particularly religious, but he had noticed that many of the memorials he had seen on television included candles. There was something universal about candlelight, something that crossed all boundaries of faith and culture. In the shop, surrounded by crucifixes and prayer books, James selected a simple white votive candle in a glass holder. The elderly nun running the shop blessed his purchase without asking any questions, which James took as a good sign. That night at work, James could barely contain his nervous energy. He went through his usual routines, checking doors, monitoring the security systems, walking his prescribed routes through the galleries, but his mind was entirely focused on the mission ahead. At precisely 2:30 in the morning, when he knew the building would be at its quietest, he made his way to the basement levels. Room B47 was exactly as he remembered it. Dusty, cluttered, forgotten. James switched on the overhead lights and looked around, trying to see the space through new eyes. In the far corner, behind a stack of empty wooden crates, was a small alcove that would be perfect for his purposes. It was like a natural shrine, enclosed on three sides by old storage shelving, but open enough to allow for proper arrangement of his memorial items. James cleared the space carefully, moving aside boxes of pottery shards and rolled-up tapestries that had seen better days. The work was harder than he had expected. His back wasn't as strong as it once was, and the dust made him cough. But as the alcove began to take shape, he felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced in years. First, he positioned the silver frame on a small wooden shelf that appeared to be original to the room. The photograph of Diana fit perfectly, and even in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the storage room, her smile seemed warm and alive. James stood back and studied the effect. She looked like she belonged there, surrounded by history and treasures, her image at home among the artifacts of human civilization. The white roses came next. James had brought a small glass vase from home, nothing fancy but clean and clear. He arranged the flowers carefully, placing the single yellow rose in the center, surrounded by the white ones. The fragrance filled the small alcove, a living presence that seemed to breathe life into the forgotten corner of the museum. The candle was the final touch. James placed it on the floor in front of the shrine, in a position where its light would illuminate Diana's photograph and the flowers. When he lit it, the entire alcove was transformed. The harsh overhead lights no longer seemed necessary. The candle created pools of warm golden light that made the entire memorial feel sacred, peaceful, complete. James knelt in front of his creation for a long moment, not in prayer exactly, but in a kind of communion with the woman whose memory he was honoring. He thought about all the public memorials that were taking place above ground, the speeches and ceremonies and official tributes. Those were important, he knew, but they belonged to the world. This belonged to Diana alone. "I know you can't see this," he whispered to the photograph, feeling slightly foolish, but continuing anyway. "But I wanted you to know that somebody remembers not just what you did, but who you were. Somebody thinks you deserve a place where you can rest in peace, where nobody is watching, where nobody wants anything from you." The candle flickered slightly, though there was no breeze in the sealed room. James chose to take it as acknowledgement, as Diana's way of saying she understood. Over the following weeks, James fell into a new routine. Each night, he would spend a few minutes in room B47, replacing the flowers when they wilted, lighting a fresh candle, sometimes bringing small additions to the shrine. A book of poetry he thought Diana might have enjoyed, a small stuffed animal like the one she had been photographed giving to sick children. A few times, he even brought newspaper clippings about her charitable work, reading them aloud to her photograph as if delivering news from the outside world. The memorial became the center of James's life, the one thing that gave meaning to his solitary nights and quiet days. He was more careful than ever about his security duties, knowing that any slip in his professional performance might lead to increased scrutiny, but he also felt more alive than he had in years, more connected to something larger than himself. What James didn't know was that his secret was about to be discovered, and that the discovery would come from the most unexpected source imaginable. The memorial he had created in love and solitude was about to become something much larger, something that would challenge everything he thought he understood about grief, memory, and the power of human connection. Diana's spirit, it seemed, had ways of bringing people together that even death couldn't diminish. 6 weeks had passed since James created his secret memorial when Dr. Sarah Chen stumbled into his carefully guarded world. Dr. Chen was the museum's newest curator, a 34-year-old specialist in medieval manuscripts who had recently transferred from the Victoria and Albert Museum. She was known for her meticulous attention to detail and her habit of working unusual hours, often staying late into the evening to catalogue new acquisitions or prepare exhibition materials. It was a Tuesday night in late October when Dr. Chen's research led her to the basement storage areas. She was hunting for a particular illuminated manuscript that had been mentioned in a donation record from 1987, but had somehow never made it into the main cataloguing system. The description suggested it might be a significant find, a 14th century book of hours with possible connections to the court of Edward III. If authentic, it could be worth millions and would certainly merit its own exhibition. James was completing his rounds on the 3rd floor when the security system chimed, indicating that someone had used a keycard to access the basement storage levels. He checked his watch, 11:45 p.m. None of the other guards was scheduled to be in that area, and the cleaning crew had finished hours earlier. Grabbing his flashlight and radio, James headed downstairs to investigate. He found Dr. Chen in room B43. 3 doors down from his secret memorial, surrounded by boxes of manuscripts and wearing white cotton gloves. She looked up when his flashlight beam swept across the doorway, squinting in the sudden brightness. "Oh! You startled me," she said, pulling off one glove to show her identification badge. "I'm Dr. Chen, Medieval Manuscripts. I have authorization to be here. I'm searching for a missing catalog entry." James recognized her from the staff meetings, though they had never been formally introduced. She seemed harmless enough, but her presence in the basement made him nervous. Room B47 was just down the hall, and while it was always kept locked, the proximity of another person to his secret felt dangerously close. "Working late tonight, Dr. Chen," James observed, keeping his tone professionally neutral. "Please, call me Sarah." "And yes?" "I'm afraid so. This manuscript has been driving me crazy for weeks. The donor record clearly states it was accepted and assigned to basement storage, but there's no follow-up documentation. It's like it just vanished." She gestured helplessly at the chaos of boxes around her. James felt a stab of sympathy. He knew what it was like to search for something important, something that mattered deeply but seemed impossible to find. "Need any help? I know these storage areas pretty well." Sarah's face brightened. "That would be wonderful, actually. I'm looking for a leather-bound manuscript, probably wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, with a note indicating possible Plantagenet provenance. It could be in any of these rooms." For the next hour, James helped Sarah search through boxes and shelves, moving carefully through the maze of stored artifacts. She was easy to work with, respectful of his knowledge of the building's layout, and genuinely grateful for his assistance. As they worked, they talked about the museum, about the challenges of preserving history, about the satisfaction of uncovering forgotten treasures. "I sometimes think the real treasures aren't the ones on display," Sarah said as she carefully rewrapped a damaged psalter. "They're the ones hidden away down here, waiting for someone to rediscover their importance." The comment hit James unexpectedly hard. His memorial was certainly hidden away, and it was definitely important to him, but he had never thought of it as waiting to be rediscovered. In his mind, secrecy was essential to its meaning. The moment it became known to others, it would transform into something else entirely. They were searching through room B45 when Sarah noticed the sweet smell of roses in the air. She paused, lifting her head like an animal catching an unfamiliar scent. "Do you smell that?" she asked. "Flowers?" James's blood turned to ice. The roses in his memorial were less than a week old, and apparently their fragrance was carrying through the basement corridors. "Probably just air freshener from the cleaning crew," he said quickly, but he could hear the tension in his own voice. Sarah looked puzzled. "It smells like real flowers to me. Fresh roses." She began moving toward the source of the scent, her curiosity clearly piqued. "It's coming from this direction."
James found himself in an impossible position.
He could try to discourage Sarah's investigation, but that would almost certainly raise more questions than it answered. He could claim there was a problem with the security system in that area, but she would expect him to investigate and file a report. He could simply refuse to let her proceed, but again, such behavior would seem bizarre and unprofessional. As Sarah approached room B47, James realized he had only one choice that might preserve both his secret and his dignity. He would have to trust her, Sarah, he said quietly. "Before you go any further, I need to tell you something. What you're about to see, it's not official museum business."
Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "What do you mean?"
James took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would either destroy everything he had built or transform it into something entirely new.
"I mean that room B47 contains something that I put there, something personal, something that could get me fired if the wrong people found out about it. James, you're scaring me a little. What exactly is in that room?" "A memorial," he said simply, "for Princess Diana." Sarah's eyebrows rose. Of all the things she might have expected him to say, that wasn't one of them. A memorial? Here in the museum? Not an official one. Just something I needed to do. For myself. For her. James pulled out his key card and looked at it thoughtfully. "I suppose you have every right to see it, since you've stumbled this far into the situation. But I need you to understand that this isn't some kind of prank or statement. This is something sacred to me." Sarah studied his face for a long moment. She saw pain there and longing and a deep sincerity that was impossible to fake. "Show me," she said, softly. James unlocked room B47 and pushed open the door. The overhead lights revealed the cluttered storage space, But Sarah's attention was immediately drawn to the alcove in the far corner, where candlelight flickered warmly across Diana's photograph and a fresh arrangement of white and yellow roses. She walked toward the memorial slowly, as if approaching something fragile that might disappear if she moved too quickly. When she reached the alcove, she knelt down exactly as James had done on that first night, drawn by an impulse she couldn't have explained. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and James heard genuine emotion in her voice. "How long have you been coming here?" "Since 2 weeks after she died. 7 weeks now." James remained by the door, watching Sarah's reaction carefully. "I know it sounds foolish. I know she was just a celebrity to most people, but she felt like more than that to me. She felt like hope." Sarah reached out as if to touch the photograph, then stopped herself. "It doesn't sound foolish at all. She touched a lot of people's lives. The fact that you found a way to honor that connection, it's actually quite moving."
You won't report it?
Sarah stood and turned to face him, her expression serious but kind.
James, I work with artifacts every day.
"I spend my time with objects that people created centuries ago to express things they couldn't put into words. Devotion, love, faith, hope."
That's exactly what you've done here.
"You've created an artifact of your own grief and admiration. Why would I want to destroy that?" Relief flooded through James so powerfully that he had to lean against the doorframe for support. "Thank you," he managed to say. "But I do have one request," Sarah continued. "Would you mind if I visited sometimes? Not to interfere or change anything, but just to be here with her?" "With you? I think she was remarkable too, and I'd like to have a place where I can remember her quietly." James looked at Sarah, then at his memorial, then back at Sarah. He had spent 7 weeks believing that sharing his secret would diminish it, would make it less pure and meaningful. But standing here with someone who understood, someone who saw what he had created and recognized its value, he realized he might have been wrong. Perhaps some treasures were meant to be shared after all. "I think she would like that," he said finally. "I think she would want people to find each other through remembering her." From that night forward, Sarah became a regular visitor to room B47. She brought her own small contributions, a book of Diana's speeches, a picture of the princess visiting a children's hospital, sometimes just a single flower to add to James's arrangements. They rarely spoke during these visits, but they shared a comfortable silence that felt more meaningful than most conversations. What neither James nor Sarah realized was that their secret partnership was about to expand again, in ways that would test their ability to protect something precious while sharing it with others who needed it just as much as they did. Diana's memorial was becoming exactly what she had been in life, a gathering place for people who believed in the power of compassion to change the world. The third person to discover Diana's secret memorial came not through accident or investigation, but through an act of desperate hope. Marcus Williams was a 17-year-old student from East London who had been visiting the British Museum twice a week for 3 months, not to see the exhibitions, but to escape from a home situation that had become unbearable since his mother's death the previous spring. Marcus had discovered that museum membership was surprisingly affordable for students and that the building's vast spaces and quiet corners provided refuge from the cramped flat he now shared with his father, a man whose grief had transformed into anger and whose anger had found its primary target in his surviving son. The museum became Marcus's sanctuary, a place where he could sit among ancient civilizations and try to imagine a future where pain didn't define everything. Sarah Chen, who first noticed Marcus. As someone who spent considerable time in the museum's quieter areas, she began to recognize the thin teenager who always sat alone, usually with textbooks spread around him but rarely appearing to study. He favored the benches near the Greek sculptures, where the lighting was good and foot traffic was light. Sarah's instincts as both an educator and a human being told her that Marcus was more than just a dedicated student seeking a peaceful study environment. On a Thursday evening in mid-November, Sarah approached Marcus during one of his visits. He was sitting with his head in his hands, his untouched homework spread across the bench beside him. She could see that he had been crying. "Excuse me," she said gently, settling onto the opposite end of the bench. "I'm Dr. Chen, one of the curators here. I've noticed you studying here quite often. Are you working on a research project?" Marcus looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and suspicious. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I have a membership. I'm allowed to be here." "Of course you are," Sarah assured him quickly. "I wasn't questioning your right to be here. I just wondered if you needed any help with your research. That's part of what we do, help people find what they're looking for." Something in her tone must have reached him, because Marcus's defensive posture softened slightly. "I'm not really researching anything specific. I like it here. It's quiet." Sarah nodded understandingly. It is quiet. Sometimes that's exactly what we need. She paused, studying his face. Would you like to talk about whatever's troubling you? Sometimes it helps to talk to someone who doesn't know your whole story. Over the next hour, Marcus's story tumbled out in fragments and false starts. His mother had died of cancer 8 months earlier. His father, never particularly emotional or communicative, had become even more withdrawn and bitter. The 2-bedroom flat felt like a prison where grief lived in every corner and conversation was impossible. Marcus spent as little time there as possible, staying late at school, walking the streets, and eventually discovering the museum as a refuge. Mum loved Princess Diana, Marcus said unexpectedly, wiping his nose with his sleeve. She cried for 3 days when Diana died. Said it felt like losing a friend, even though they'd never met. I didn't understand it then, but I think I do now. Sometimes you can love someone just for what they represent, for how they make you feel about the possibility of goodness in the world. Sarah felt her heart contract. She thought about the memorial in room B47, about James's similar need to honor someone who had represented hope and compassion in a difficult world. An idea began to form in her mind, dangerous perhaps, but potentially healing.
Marcus,
She said carefully.
how would you feel about seeing a very special part of the museum?
Somewhere that isn't open to the public. Somewhere that might help you feel connected to your mother's memory of Diana.
What do you mean? I mean that you're not the only person who has found comfort in remembering Diana. Someone else who works here has created something beautiful in her honor. Something private and peaceful. I think your mother would have loved to see it. An hour later, Sarah led Marcus through the maze of basement corridors, stopping outside room B47. James had already finished his evening security check and would be back on the upper floors for at least 2 hours, giving them privacy for what Sarah hoped would be a meaningful encounter. When Marcus saw the memorial, his reaction was immediate and overwhelming. He fell to his knees in front of the alcove as if his legs had simply given out, and began to sob with the kind of raw emotion that comes from months of suppressed grief finally finding release. She would have loved this, he gasped between sobs. She would have thought it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Oh God, I miss her so much. Erin knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder, letting him cry without trying to comfort him with words. Sometimes grief needed space to be fully experienced before it could begin to transform into something more manageable. When Marcus's tears finally subsided, he sat back on his heels and really looked at the memorial for the first time. He noticed the care with which everything had been arranged, the fresh flowers, the warm candlelight, the peaceful expression on Diana's face in the photograph. Who did this? He asked. One of the security guards, a man named James Mitchell. He lost people too, in different ways, and Diana's death touched something deep inside him. This is how he processes that feeling.
Can I meet him?
Sarah hesitated. She had already taken a significant risk by bringing Marcus here without discussing it with James first.
Adding another person to their secret circle felt like a major decision that shouldn't be made unilaterally. Let me talk to him first, she said. This memorial is very important to him, and I need to make sure he's comfortable with expanding our little group. The next evening, Sarah found James during his dinner break and carefully explained about Marcus and his story. James listened without interruption, his weathered face thoughtful. A 17-year-old boy, he said finally. That's young to carry so much pain. The same age Diana was when she started working with children, Sarah pointed out. Old enough to understand loss, young enough to still believe healing is possible. James was quiet for a long moment, sipping his tea and staring at nothing in particular. What did he think of the memorial?
He cried.
That they were good tears, I think. Tears of recognition, of feeling understood. He said his mother would have loved it. Bring him tomorrow night, James decided. Diana spent her whole life trying to help young people who were struggling. I think she'd want us to help this one. The meeting between James and Marcus was awkward at first. Two people from completely different generations and backgrounds, brought together by their shared need to remember someone who had given them hope. But as they knelt together in front of Diana's photograph, something shifted. The memorial created its own atmosphere of acceptance and understanding. I come here most nights around 2 a.m., James told Marcus. Usually for about 15 minutes. You're welcome to join me any time you can manage it. How would I get into the building? James and Sarah exchanged glances. They were already bending rules by allowing Marcus access to restricted areas. Getting him into the museum after hours would require a completely different level of rule-breaking.
There might be a way, Sarah said slowly.
I sometimes work very late, and I have after-hours access for research purposes. If Marcus were officially volunteering to help with manuscript cataloging, he could legitimately be here with me. Would you do that? Marcus asked, his voice full of hope. Would you really let me help? Looking at his eager face, Sarah realized that she had just committed to something that could potentially end her career if discovered by the wrong people. But she also realized that she didn't care. Some things were more important than professional security. We'll figure out the details, she promised. But yes, I think we can make it work. Over the following weeks, their unusual trio established new routines. Marcus began spending several evenings a week at the museum, officially helping Sarah with manuscript research, but always ending his visits with time at Diana's memorial. James adjusted his rounds to spend longer periods in room B47, creating space for conversation and shared reflection. The memorial itself evolved to reflect its expanded community. Marcus brought a small toy bear that had belonged to his mother, placing it carefully beside Diana's photograph. Sarah contributed a beautiful hand-lettered quote from one of Diana's speeches about the power of love to overcome fear. James began bringing fresh flowers more frequently, creating more elaborate arrangements that reflected the joy of shared purpose rather than solitary grief. What none of them expected was how much they would come to depend on each other outside of their memorial visits. Sarah became a surrogate aunt to Marcus, helping him navigate college applications and offering the kind of maternal guidance he desperately missed. James found himself opening up about his military service and the losses he had experienced, sharing stories he had never told anyone. Marcus brought youth and energy to their group, reminding the adults what it felt like to believe that the future could be better than the past. Their secret was holding, but it was also growing, and as winter settled over London, each of them began to wonder if Diana's memorial was meant to remain hidden forever, or if it was preparing them for something larger, something that would require them to risk everything they had built in service of something even more meaningful. The crisis that would test everything James, Sarah, and Marcus had built together came on a cold February morning in 1998, 5 months after their secret memorial had become the center of their lives. Dr. Patricia Waverley, the museum's deputy director and a woman known for her rigid adherence to protocol, announced a comprehensive audit of all basement storage areas. Budget cuts had made it necessary to maximize the use of every available space, and several rooms that had been used for long-term storage would need to be cleared and repurposed for new acquisitions. Room B47 was on the list. James learned about the audit from Mrs. Henderson during the morning shift change. The cleaning would begin the following Monday, giving them exactly 4 days to figure out how to preserve Diana's memorial without destroying their careers or exposing their months of rule-breaking. "We have to move everything," Sarah said when James found her in the manuscripts department that afternoon. Her usually calm demeanor had given way to barely controlled panic. "We have to dismantle the whole memorial and find somewhere else to put it." "Where?" James asked practically. "Every room in this building is either public space or assigned storage. There's nowhere else that would be private enough and safe enough for what we've created." "Then we have to tell someone. We have to make it official somehow." James shook his head firmly. "The moment we tell anyone in authority about this, it stops being what Diana deserves and starts being what the museum thinks is appropriate." "Do you really want Diana's memorial turned into a tourist attraction or a PR opportunity?" They were still debating options when Marcus arrived for his evening volunteer session. When they explained the situation to him, his reaction surprised them both. "What if we don't move it?" he said quietly. "What if we let them find it?" "Marcus, we'd all be fired," Sarah protested. "James could lose his pension, I could lose my career. You could be banned from the museum entirely. But what if the people who find it understand what it means?" Marcus continued, his young face serious and determined. "What if they see what we see? What if Diana's memorial is ready to help more people than just us?" James studied the teenager's face, seeing something there that reminded him powerfully of Diana herself. A willingness to take risks for the sake of helping others, even when the personal cost might be enormous. "You're suggesting we leave everything exactly as it is and hope for the best," James said. "I'm suggesting we trust Diana," Marcus replied. "We all came to her memorial because we needed something we couldn't find anywhere else. Maybe there are other people who need the same thing. Maybe it's time to find out." Over the weekend, the three of them spent hours in room B47, not preparing to dismantle the memorial, but instead perfecting it. They cleaned every surface, arranged the flowers with extra care, and even added a small handwritten note explaining the memorial's history and meaning. If it was going to be discovered, they wanted it to be discovered in its most beautiful state. James wrote the note, his careful handwriting covering 2 pages of museum stationery. "To whoever finds this memorial, what you see here was created out of love and respect for Princess Diana. a woman who spent her life trying to make the world more compassionate. This room has been a place of peace and healing for several people who needed a quiet space to remember someone who gave them hope. We ask only that you judge what we have done with the same kindness that Diana showed to everyone she met. If this memorial has broken rules, it has broken them in service of something larger than rules, the human need to honor those we love and to find connection with others who understand our grief and our gratitude. On Monday morning, James arrived for his shift, knowing it might be his last day as a museum employee. Sarah came in early, ostensibly to work on manuscript cataloging, but actually to be available when the discovery inevitably occurred. Marcus couldn't concentrate on his classes and spent the day checking his phone obsessively, waiting for news. The cleaning crew reached room B47 at 11:30 a.m. James heard about it 20 minutes later when Mrs. Corpgream Henderson knocked on the security office door, her face pale and her voice shaking. "James, you need to come with me right now. Dr. Waverley wants to see you in her office immediately." The walk through the museum's administrative corridors felt like a funeral march. James had rehearsed what he would say, how he would take full responsibility and protect Sarah and Marcus from any consequences. But when he walked into Dr. Waverley's office and saw her sitting behind her massive desk with tears running down her cheeks, he realized that his prepared speech would not be necessary. "James," she said, gesturing for him to sit down, "I've just come from room B47. I've seen what you created there."
Octa.
"Waverley, I can explain." "Let me finish," she interrupted gently. "What you created there is one of the most moving things I've ever seen in my 30 years at this museum. I stood in that room for 20 minutes, looking at Princess Diana's photograph and reading your note, and I understood something that I hadn't understood before." James waited, afraid to hope, afraid to breathe. "Museums are supposed to preserve things that matter to human civilization," Dr. Waverley continued. "We spend so much time focused on objects that are hundreds or thousands of years old that sometimes we forget about the things that matter to people right now, today. Your memorial matters, James. It matters to you, and I suspect it matters to others as well." "It does," James said quietly. "To 3 of us, actually." Dr. Waverley raised her eyebrows. "3? Dr. Chen in medieval manuscripts, and a young volunteer named Marcus Williams. They've been part of this from almost the beginning." "I see. And how do you think they would feel about making your memorial, shall we say, semi-official?" James's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" "I mean that room B47 is no longer needed for general storage. I've decided to redesignate it as a memorial space, officially dedicated to the memory of Princess Diana and her charitable work. It would remain largely as you've created it, but with proper lighting, climate control, and security. It would be accessible by special arrangement to museum staff and perhaps to certain members of the public who might benefit from a quiet place of reflection." James felt tears welling in his eyes for the first time since the night he had first lit a candle in Diana's honor.
You would really do that?
James, Princess Diana visited this museum several times during her life. She brought her sons here, she supported our educational programs, and she understood that culture and history belong to everyone, not just to scholars and wealthy donors. Having a memorial to her here isn't just appropriate, it's overdue. The transformation of room B47 took 3 weeks. Professional lighting was installed to complement the candlelight that James continued to maintain. The memorial was expanded slightly, with space for visitors to leave their own small tributes. A small plaque was mounted near the entrance, reading simply, "In memory of Diana, Princess of Wales, who showed us that the greatest treasures are found in the connections we make with each other." Word of the memorial's existence spread slowly through the museum community and beyond. Staff members began visiting during their breaks, bringing flowers or simply sitting quietly in the peaceful space. A few journalists got wind of the story, but Dr. Waverley carefully managed the publicity to ensure that the memorial's essential character remained unchanged. Marcus was the first to notice the most remarkable change. People who visited the memorial alone rarely stayed alone for long. The room had a way of bringing strangers into conversation, of creating connections between people who might never have met otherwise. Grieving parents found each other there. Young people struggling with loss discovered older visitors who had survived similar pain. The memorial became exactly what Diana had been in life, a catalyst for human compassion and understanding. James continued his night shifts for another 8 years, retiring at 66 with a pension secure and a legacy that would outlive him. Sarah became the memorial's unofficial curator, ensuring that fresh flowers were always available and that visitors understood both the history and the continuing purpose of the space. Marcus went on to study social work, inspired by his experience of how one person's compassion could create ripples of healing that touched dozens of lives. 25 years later, Diana's memorial in room B47 remains one of the British Museum's most requested private visit destinations. Thousands of people have found solace there, have met others who understood their grief, have discovered that love expressed in secret can become love that transforms the world. James Mitchell, now 83 and living in a comfortable retirement home in Surrey, still receives letters from people who have visited Diana's memorial. They thank him for showing them that ordinary people can create extraordinary monuments to love, that the most important memorials are not carved in stone but built in the connections between human hearts. I just wanted to do something for her, he tells visitors who come to hear his story. I never imagined that she would find a way to do something for so many others in return. But I suppose that's who Diana was, someone who could turn any gift into something larger, something that helped people find each other and find hope. The candle in room B47 has never been allowed to go out. It burns every day, tended by a rotation of volunteers who understand that some flames are meant to be eternal, that some loves are meant to light the way for others long after their source has passed from this world. Diana's memorial proved that a veteran guard's secret act of devotion could become a beacon of healing for anyone brave enough to seek connection in a world that often feels impossibly lonely. In the end, James Mitchell's greatest discovery was not that Diana deserved to be remembered, but that remembering her together with others transformed memory into something alive, something that continued to grow and heal and inspire long after the flowers had wilted and been replaced by fresh ones, long after the original candle had burned down and been replaced by new flames, long after the 3 original visitors had become hundreds, then thousands, then a continuing stream of souls seeking the peace that comes from knowing they are not alone in their love for someone who showed them what it meant to care for others more than for themselves.